We continue in Luke 22 today at the Last Supper as Luke continues to reframe and reshape the tradition he inherited from Mark, different from Matthew as we saw last time, and especially here today as he moves the question of betrayer after the issue of the bread and the wine and what that has to do with Jesus' body and blood, and then engages it in a conversation around with the disciples around which of them is the greatest, echoing a previous, almost exactly parallel situation earlier. So as we enter into this, we need to see how Luke is not only taking the tradition he got from Mark, but reshaping it specifically for his audience and for his purpose. If you haven't watched the introduction to Luke 22 and 23 video that I posted at the beginning of this, I'd really encourage you to do so, where I show some of the issues that Luke is engaging in that makes his version of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection different from those that he inherited from Mark and Matthew, and even those from John. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, we're continuing through here in the Last Supper, and although I framed this in this way, breaking this down to these chunks, as you can see from the key words, it really breaks down a little differently here into this chiastic shape. So we're going to be we looked at this last time up to the new covenant in my blood up to verse 20, and now we're looking at the C part of the chiasm, the center of this chiasm here, and the B prime part here, so verses 21 to 27, which is a little different than the way I framed it here, but it's all part of this overall 22:14 to 30 chiasm, so we won't worry about that breakdown very much there. And as we've been noting, this is the 7th of 8 meal scenes in Luke's Gospel. Only Luke has that many meal scenes, and obviously this is what we know as the Last Supper, although whether the disciples in the story understand it as we do as the Last Supper is an interesting question that will be engaged in a certain way in today's passage. And then Luke has uniquely the final meal story in Emmaus with the risen Jesus and the two who follow them there. So one of the things we need to see here, as I was noting at the very beginning here, is how differently Luke's version shapes the story from Mark and Matthew. So Mark and Matthew both precede this. Note this is in Mark chapter 10 and Matthew chapter 20, whereas otherwise the Passion story in the Last Supper is in Mark chapter 14 and Matthew chapter 26. So this is way earlier in Mark and near the end of the discipleship catechism in Mark, just before the story of blind Bartimaeus, and then in Matthew in a similar way in a section on parables and other parallel stories. And in both Mark and Matthew, there's a story of James and John, the son of Zebedee, seeking power from Jesus when he comes into whatever that is, in his glory, as we see here, and in your kingdom, as we see in Matthew. In Mark, they come directly, and in Matthew, their mother comes, but that's not so much what's important right here. What's important is that Mark and Matthew both have two particular named disciples, James and John, seeking special privileges that lead to those around them to be upset. So as you can see at the end of Mark's little section here, when the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John, and similarly in Matthew. But Luke has nothing of that. He doesn't have anything about James and John, the sons of Zebedee. We noticed in the previous video when he sent them out to prepare for a place for the Passover, he sent Peter and John. Whereas in Mark, Peter, James, and John are often together, especially in the Transfiguration, other things. But it's Peter and John that are together in Luke and not James. And it's hard to say why that is, but there it is. So Luke, instead of having the story of the sons of Zebedee come first, has this story at the Last Supper. That Jesus told them yet again that he is going to be going the way has been determined, but one of them will betray him. And they argue amongst themselves about which one that would be, and that leads to this section here, which, as you can see, the bold part is what's unique to Luke, and the plain part is what's common to Mark and Matthew. So all he has from Mark is this little piece, and he's completely reshaped that. So it's really hard to say that Luke is taking this from Mark and Matthew. There's just that little piece about how the Gentiles, or one could translate it, the nations lorded over them, and then the great contrast there. So we'll have to look at Luke in his own context, and not so much how it's different from Mark and Matthew. Another thing that's important to see here is how this is parallel to what we saw earlier in chapter 9. Notice this is just before the journey to Jerusalem begins in 9:51, just after this, and this is just before Jesus' passion begins. And Luke is showing us something very profound in this, which is primarily that the disciples are no closer to getting what Jesus and the gospel are about now in chapter 22, just on the eve of his arrest and crucifixion, than they were before the journey to Jerusalem began in the first place. So let's look at some of the parallels here, which I've color coordinated so you can see how they are. Both of them start with Jesus saying something about himself as the human one and about being betrayed. So we saw back in chapter 9, he's going to be betrayed into human hands, and here it is going as has been determined, which we'll look at in just a minute, but woe to the one by whom he is betrayed. So here it's not so much the focus on the fact that he's going to be betrayed, and the way he's going has been determined. Jesus can reasonably assume that the disciples already know that, but what they don't know is the one who is the betrayer. But in fact, they don't know anything. And we see they don't know anything all the way, including the road to Emmaus, when the two on the road to Emmaus are still wondering about whether Jesus was the one to restore the kingdom to Israel, which we see even in Acts of the Apostles in the first chapter. So even the resurrection itself does not bring them to full consciousness of what the gospel is about, and therefore why Jesus died and what his resurrection is about. But it will be as Acts of the Apostles goes on. So good thing Luke has a second volume to not just leave the disciples in the kind of ignorance that Mark's gospel leaves them in, ecstatic and afraid at the end, but not necessarily going back to Galilee to start again, as the voice at the empty tomb tells them to do. So in chapter 9, we heard the narrator tell us they did not understand in a triple form. Not understand, its meaning was concealed and not perceive. So instead, they are afraid to ask him. And here, in a parallel way, they ask one another, implying that they're afraid to ask him who it is. Notice it doesn't have anything about them saying to Jesus, "Not I, Lord," as we see in Mark and Matthew. They're simply afraid to talk to Jesus at all. And we also saw this follows Luke's unique version of the communion Eucharist theme scene, where there's no interruption from the disciples at all. He just says what he's saying, and this is the first time here that you can see on the left side in verse 23, there's any reference to the disciples responding to what Jesus is saying at all. So they begin to ask one another which one that could be, and then they immediately go from that to arguing about which one is the greatest. And a number of scholars have noted the connection there in the Greco-Roman world around honor and dishonor, that the idea that one of them is going to betray them is a suggestion plainly of a dishonoring. And so they're immediately choosing to respond about getting relative status amongst them. And we notice that the dispute here, we'll look at the word in a minute, is a very strong word, parallel to the word for argument here back in chapter 9. And in both cases, Jesus is plainly aware of what's going on. In chapter 9, the narrator tells us that, but in our current passage in chapter 22, he can obviously hear them arguing, and so he responds in the way he does here. Notice that in both there's a question of a child. Here he literally takes a little child and puts it by his side, and in our current passage he refers to the youngest. So not necessarily the greatest and the lowliest, but interesting contrast to the greatest and the youngest, making like a child. And similarly, the comparison, although not explicit, about serving or welcoming. So the least among you is those who is the greatest, and the one who serves is the one who is also the greatest, and Jesus is the one who serves. Which brings up the verb diakoneo here, and I'll bring it up now, even though we'll see it in verse 27 since I'm on the screen. And we can see it in the various places, blue for when it's involving women, and red for when it's involving men. And I left the no RSV translations there, even though plainly here we hear it as serve, but here we hear it in other ways, provided, or tasks, or work, or helpers, or wait on tables there. But it's all the same word here for diakoneo, which can come out as deacons later, as it does in Acts of the Apostles here, that they established something called deacons. And so what we see certainly in what Jesus is told earlier, these examples are not from Jesus other than here Jesus' mother-in-law, or Peter's mother-in-law rather, gets up to serve them, as the women do here. But here it's Jesus giving these countercultural examples about the master coming alert. He will fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. And here is in chapter 17 is the normal version of prepare supper for me, says the owner of the house, put on your apron and serve me, which is to say they should not get credit for being what they were supposed to be, which is servants. And now we get to this current passage here. So plainly for Luke's Jesus and for Luke overall, the question of serving from below is a key expression of the kind of greatness Jesus is about. And for Luke's audience, that could not be any more radically countercultural than that. Everything young Roman would would have been about would have been establishing greater honor and rising up the ladder so that they could be a benefactor and or a patron to others below them. And we'll see exactly how Jesus addresses that today in verse 25. So let's leave our scene up here in comparison, and we'll go over our passage starting in verse 21. And I left the last line of verse 20 up so we can see how harsh the transition is. There's basically no transition. So the new covenant, my blood, referring to the second cup, the cup after the bread. But now this sharp shift. But see, behold, Edu, one of the rare situations where it translates the word mean see as see rather than as listen, as it did a few verses before. But see or behold, the one who betrays me is with me, and his hand is on the table. Now, we know it's Judas. They don't know it's Judas. But there's something else going on here, because he doesn't specify it's Judas here. And unlike in John's gospel, where the so-called beloved disciple, at Peter's behest, turns to Jesus and says, "Who is it?" And Jesus says, "It's the one with whom I dipped the bread," and that turns out to be Judas. Here it's not revealed to be Judas, but rather it's revealed to be all of them, because all of their hands are on the table here, and that's the issue. And the betrayal here is not simply what Judas does. It's not simply turning Jesus over to the Jerusalem elite and thus to the Romans, but it's arguing amongst themselves about who is the greatest, and therefore betraying the entire essence of the gospel, which is to be the opposite of what the Roman Empire's paideia that they've learned when they were younger, the formal educational process that not only taught skills, but social codes taught them to be. To not see themselves as below and to look down on people below, except in the kind of condescension that gives them things so that you can get the praise and benefits of being a benefactor or a patron. So this is the opposite. This is serving from the below with no expectation of honor, and the extreme example of that, of course, is the cross, where Jesus is not only betrayed but humiliated, but doing it for service of others and breaking the imperial cycle of violence through his embodied witness. So we can see if we look at the key words, that the word for betray, which you've seen before, paradidomai, which literally means to hand over, both in the positive sense of handing on tradition and in the negative sense here of handing someone over. And I'd like to highlight that because it doesn't include the word hand, but it implies hand, and the hand is on the table echoes that. It's not a linguistic echo. The word for betray here, as I have, is paradidomai, and the word for hand is kair. So there's not a word play exactly, but there's a thematic play of the one who hands me over, and his hand is on the table, which is to say the trapezist sharing the meal with me. That will come out exactly what we see in verse 23. So then we hear Jesus express this human one saying here in his green notes below, a transparent affirmation of the larger biblical notion of dual causation, a refusal to collapse the tension between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. I think that's exactly right there. So for those in a dualistic frame of mind, as certainly the philosophically oriented Christian so-called church fathers were that developed the creed, arguing over the seemingly mutually incompatible notions of Jesus being human and divine, here in the question of causation, they both operate together without trying to separate them out, which is to say, as it has been determined, which is to say there's a plan, and we see that again in Acts of the Apostles that you can see right here, the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed, which is to say the human free will operates at the same time with divine sovereignty. And if our reasonable minds can't parse that out, well, it just shows how small our reasonable minds are compared to the mind of God. As so classic we hear in Isaiah, your ways are not my ways are as far above your ways as the sky is above the earth. And so if that bothers us, well, we just have to let it bother us. I suppose much like my dog may be bothered when I go out the door and I can't explain where I'm going or how long I'll be gone, but my dog just trusts I'll be back, and I am back. So we can trust that Jesus is this Word of God, and that we have free will, and that God has a plan, and that we can choose to cooperate with it or not cooperate with it. And Judas cooperates with it, and as Jesus ended up being turned over. Not that God wanted Judas to be unfaithful, but that there was room for the betrayer in what is part of God's plan. So that's what's going on here. And so woe to the one by whom he is betrayed. This is the final woe in Luke's gospel, and you can see all the others back to the Sermon on the Plain, contrasting with the Beatitudes there. Woe to the one by whom he's betrayed, leaving out the question, better that he would never have been born. But notice it's not highlighting specifically that it's Judas. It could easily be all of them here. And that's my note below. So they began to ask one another using the word suzetio, to seek together. Zetio, the word for to seek, as in seeking and to find, but also can be used for to persecute, although diago is another word for to pursue, as in to pursue in hunting. But ziato can also be used that way. So this is to seek together. But they're seeking together apart from Jesus, and that's, of course, the problem here. And which one of them it could be who would do this, or which one would come to pass, using an interesting biblical form of speech there. And while they're doing that, the conversation shifts. So it shifts from which one of them could betray Jesus to which one of them is the greatest. And the word here, philonikia, is only here in the New Testament. And there's a Louw-Nida lexicon says it means desire to quarrel. It's only found in the Septuagint in very late texts in 2nd Maccabees and twice in 4th Maccabees. As in 4th Maccabees, it's part of a vice list. So it's plainly seen there before Luke was written as a negative behavior. And the displacement of this episode of the Last Supper links this argument over greatness to the betrayal. And we could see an example of that in 1 Corinthians, where it's part of a negative behavior there as well. So they're engaging in what readers should hear, at least from Luke's perspective, as a negative behavior, and the content as it is which one of them is to be thought of by others as the greatest. Note they're not asking this like it's a factual question, as if it could be answered in some objective way, but who is perceived, doke einai, who is perceived out there as greatest. So they're concerned, as any good Roman young person would be, with their reputation in public. And the dark irony here is that anybody following Jesus at this point could be seen as great by their Roman peers, would be laughed at completely. But they're still caught in the in-between place of following Jesus, but not quite getting what it means exactly to follow him. So for the greatest here, megas here, 33 times in Luke, and we see it's a key word 3 times in this little passage. So he says to them, without addressing that, without chastising them, without either responding to the question of who it could be in verse 23, or plainly not responding to which one of them is the greatest in verse 24, he says this. And as we'll note, there are 2 aspects of this here, and we'll see one part of it here, and we'll see the other part of it in verses 28 to 30 next time. So he said to them, and notice how this element is echoed a little bit in Mark and Matthew, but not quite the same there. So we can see the comparative versions from there. So the kings of the Gentiles, and I left it Gentiles here, although as I've noted earlier in our engagement with Luke, Gentiles seems to be an unnecessary version of a Christian supersessionism, seeing the non-Jews as Gentiles, as opposed to what's really at stake here is the ethnoi, the nations, the ethnos singular here, various times. So the kings of the nations, the various nations, lord it over them. Using the word as a verb here, to lord over, and it's interestingly not in the Gospels other than parallels here, but other than in Romans. And so they lord it over them. They use their power to be hierarchically dominant over them. And those in authority, which is somehow different than the king, so that would be among the elite over them, are called benefactors. Ergatai here. And my note has patrons, and that's where I'm wrong. I left that there to highlight that even people like me who've been doing this for decades can learn from more recent scholarship. And in this case, from J. Marshall, who argues at length that benefactor and patron are not equivalent, and that what Jesus is doing here is benefaction, not patronage. And he argues further the distinction between quote-unquote sociological patronage, which is present all around then and now, which is to say, like patrons of the arts, when people offer financial support in order to get their name raised up and to get honor and recognition, from Roman patrocinium, which is a particular Latin word for a practice involved in specific Roman relationships. So he's not denying the fact that the broader anthropological concept of patronage isn't at work here, but simply not the Roman formal element. The Romans see this as benefaction, which is to say somebody doing something good for others for which they're grateful, but don't necessarily enter into a patronage-client relationship. And in this case, conferring a kingdom on you. And that's the issue that we'll see down in the next unit, in the next video. So those in authority are called benefactors, those who look down from above and do other good things for other people. But it's not to be that way among you. And this goes completely contrary to what it would be like in the Roman world. One of the clearest examples of how Luke is really writing a countercultural narrative for his audience. My note below has from Maguno, writing from Nigeria, highlighting the importance of this teaching even within a religious community of women even today, because the church in Africa in so many places still maintains a strong patriarchal hierarchy there. So women in churches in Africa really are calling upon these passages to have the church live the gospel and not the traditional African cultural codes that have been imposed upon it, as so many in the Western world have capitalist codes imposed on them, as we see here in the United States, where I'm writing and speaking from here. But he says, so not so among you. Rather, instead, the greatest, or the greatest among you, must become like the youngest, the neoteros here. And that's what we see in the story of the prodigal son, the younger son there, and the leader like one who serves here, using hegumenos here, which is what Pilate is as the governor, and not using archon for a general term for leader or ruler, but simply for somebody with authority over others, must be like one who serves, like the women. And as so often the case, the women model it, and we'll see that at the foot of the cross, and we'll also see it in Acts of the Apostles in a couple of interesting situations. And one like serves reminds me of the great founder of Black liberation theology, the late James Cone, who, when asked in a Fresh Air episode with NPR's Terry Gross one time about what it was like for him growing up in the church in Arkansas, where he grew up, he said there the black people who were the maids and janitors out in the public were the deacons and on the boards in church. And so there, the people that were forced to serve in public because of racism and classism became leaders inside the church. For a white audience, of course, or for an audience of the elite like Luke's Roman audience, it involves a reversal of status, not the increase in status it meant for black people in the racist South at the time. And so Jesus continues here in the final verse, recalling what we saw in chapter 17, for who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? And that recollection is the one that I already brought up earlier that we see here around service in this scene. Plainly, the answer in the Roman world is the one who is at the table is greater, and that's the answer he gives in the rhetorical question. But he says, but I am among you as one who serves. So the irony is he would be saying, I am not the greatest, because plainly the answer to the question of who is the greatest is the one at the table, which he says. So now he's saying, I am not the greatest, and you shouldn't become the greatest either, even though he's just said the greatest among you must become like the youngest. So what he's basically saying is, once you become that, you are no longer the greatest. He's not changing the sense of greatness to mean greatness means to serve. He's saying you must give up the notion of being great altogether. And you must also give up the notion of being benefactors, but we'll see how that plays out next time as he talks to them about distributed power on 12 tribes, 12 thrones. Stay tuned for that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.